Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is a very good game that has made a very vocal minority very angry. But why? The short answer is because it includes a gay romance. The more complicated answer is it includes the option for a gay romance between the two previously established main characters from the first game. It would be easy to just write this off as homophobia, but that wouldn't just be an oversimplification, it would be a disservice to how interesting, I think at least, this whole situation is. To get down to the actual reason why there's so much vitriol towards this relationship, you've got to dive even deeper, because much like the game itself, there's a lot of history here. On top of the controversy and how it did or didn't affect the game's reputation, I also want to analyze the relationship itself and why it stands out not just for being a gay relationship, but for being a type of romance that hasn't been seen in gaming before, and why that's got some people confused. Okay, I've thoroughly beaten around that bush now, so let's get to the timeline. Before Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, naturally there was Kingdom Come Deliverance 1. Developed by Warhorse Studios, the Kickstarter-funded game released in 2018. We follow Henry Iskalets in 1403 Bohemia, a predecessor state to what we now know as the Czech Republic or Czechia, whose silver mining hometown was raided by the invading forces of Hungarian King Sigismund, leading to the death of his parents. Starting as a blacksmith's son, Henry works up from his humble beginnings to settle in Ratai, join the service of Lord Radzig, and in doing so become part of the resistance against Sigismund's invasion. There is of course more to the 50-ish hour game than this, but for the sake of those who've already played it, you can find a more comprehensive summary elsewhere. But for the sake of this topic, what's most important is that on his journey, Henry makes the acquaintance of Sir Hans Capon, nobleman of Ratai who's a similar age to Henry, but as you can imagine, of a very different social standing. Their relationship has a rocky start with their clashing personalities and class divide having them begin as squabbling enemies. But after a hunting trip, bathhouse antics, Hans getting shot in the behind, and Henry saving his life a couple of times, they gradually form a strong and believable friendship. The game ends with them as brothers in arms, and Henry acting his bodyguard and page as they set off into the sunset towards an upcoming quest. The game was touted as being as historically accurate as possible, with studio founder Dan Vavra repeatedly stating throughout the game's whole pre-release press tour how dedicated the team were to accurately representing this era of Czech history.
We are studying medieval manuscripts, working closely together with universities, museums and historians, and talking to real sword fighters who mastered 15th century swordsmanship. No one has tried to create a historically accurate and realistic RPG yet. That's our edge.
However, with the bar being set so high, the game was immediately targeted post-release for not achieving the level of accuracy excited historians were hoping that it would. The true scope of the debate around the original Kingdom Come Deliverance's portrayal of 15th century Bohemia is pretty massive, which upon consideration makes sense. A game with such lofty ambitions aiming to create a whole historically accurate world encompassing so many different elements of day-to-day life, of course people are going to try and poke holes in it. If you're interested in diving into this topic more, the Wikipedia page for this game has a sizable historical accuracy section with plenty of sources all collated in one place. But back to the topic at hand, just one aspect of the game's depiction that was easy for the gaming public to latch onto as a source for discourse was diversity.
The theme of authenticity became more forceful, however, when Warhorse met with suggestions that the game's portrayal of Bohemia seemed a teensy bit slanted, omitting non-white people from the setting despite evidence of their presence, while also adhering to the stereotype of medieval women as passive and subordinate and peripheral.
As you'll quickly learn, Dan Vavra is not one to shy away from responding to criticism.
He responded by asserting that the game's depiction of ethnicity and gender are true to accounts of the period, while decrying Western journalists at large as a bunch of would-be censors and hypocrites.
During all of this, it also came out that Vavra had publicly supported the Gamergate movement around the time of its inception back in 2014. While Gamergate is another rabbit hole that's easy to fall down, I'll give the brief definition of it being a misogynistic online harassment campaign motivated by a right-wing backlash against feminism, diversity, and progressivism in video game culture. And even though it's been about a decade since it started, while the movement doesn't use the original name much anymore, its impact is still being felt. Of course, as Vavra being associated with Gamergate and his defensiveness around his game's approach to diversity, people started putting the pieces together. While it never became one of the major talking points of the release period media hurricane, around the same time the Warhorse Studios official YouTube channel responded to a now deleted comment asking about the potential for same-sex romance in the game. They said that while there are some homosexual NPCs, Henry already does have a background story in which he's not bi or homosexual, and went on to reinforce this with another reply saying yes, he is straight. As you can imagine, this YouTube comment has been taken as gospel, and it's worth keeping in mind. In spite of the game's mixed reviews upon release, it went on to become a cult classic, selling well and gaining a loyal following. While of course most of these fans are perfectly normal, it was also held in high regard by what we now know as anti-woke gamers, thanks to the aforementioned slanted approach to diversity. Fast forward to 2024 and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is announced, and with Vavra still at the helm, it's thought by some that his politics from the original would carry over. Skipping forward to January 2025, only a couple of weeks before the game's early February release date, thanks to critics and influencers already having early access to the game, leaks started flowing. The most interesting of these being the presence of a potential same-sex romance option, and even more surprising that it could be with Hans.
If this is true, it's really pretty gross. It completely ruins the bromance and turns it into something perverse. I don't see any way that it could be Hans, and I would be willing to bet money. If they ruin it with this, it will truly be the final nail in the coffin of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2.
But of course, reactions calmed down when the leaks were confirmed true.
Do not try and tell me that there isn't an agenda here. Bad writing and strictly fan service. When straight men face hell together, they are forged into brothers. They don't experience sexual tension. Gay sex is pure depravity and nothing else. The fact that Warhorse Studios had previously emphasised that Henry was hetero, only to go back on their word years later, verifies for me that the option of gay romance between Henry and Hans was due to peer pressure, money, politics, awards, rather than it being their vision.
The anti-woke crowd felt betrayed not just by Warhorse but by Dan Vavra specifically, and they managed to kick up enough of the stink that he responded with a 10-tweet long thread addressing it.
As much as I don't like forced diversity, nobody was forcing us to do anything, and we are not forcing anyone to do certain things. Gay characters were already in KCD1. If you want Henry to try a same-sex adventure, feel free. If you don't want to, you don't have to. All affairs are purely optional. The characters are perfectly aware that it was a forbidden sin.
Also worth mentioning, Vavra uses Fred to defend the inclusion of Musa of Mali, a black character added in the sequel, much to the anger of pretty much the same crowd. Who knows how much Vavra's personal politics changed between his Gamergate tweet in 2014 and this thread in 2025, because even though what he says does matter, since he is the face of Kingdom Come's developers after all, it's important to not forget that he's far from the only person who worked on the game. It's easy to stamp a game's whole identity onto one person, but crediting every creative decision to one guy is a disservice to all the people who've worked on the game, and also speculating about a potential change of heart Vavra went through at one point would be just that, speculation. Even so, this response didn't do much to calm anyone down, and then came the cries of disavowalment, promises to cancel pre-orders, and prophecies on how the game was doomed to fail, the infamous go woke, go broke. But of course, with the glorious power of hindsight, we can see that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 went woke, went massively successful. The mixed reviews of the original were switched for almost universal praise for the sequel, and it sold 2 million copies in less than 2 weeks, an achievement that took the first a year. So, like clockwork, the anti-woke moans sheepishly die down to a mumble, and they wait around for the next thing to get angry about, in this case being Avowed, Lost Records Bloom and Rage, Monster Hunter Wilds, and most recently Assassin's Creed Shadows. They clearly move on fast. So while that cycle has started anew, that's really just a context for why some people are so angry about the Hans and Henry romance. That was just a pre-release after all. To look at why there's still complaints about the relationship even after people had their hands on the game, we need to look at the relationship itself and address the 3 main arguments against it. Even though there have been countless posts, videos and threads on why Hans and Henry don't belong together, these can mostly be sorted into a handful of different groups. I'm going to discount blatant homophobia because there's no reasoning with that and I've given it enough time of day already, and while there's something to be said about historical accuracy, I'll save that for later. Instead, I'll focus on points that stem from at least semi-legitimate complaints, so I'll start with the argument that I find the most interesting.
Objection!
The most prevalent complaint about Henry and Hans is that it comes out of nowhere and that it's unnatural. Not unnatural in the biblical sense, but unnatural as in it doesn't make sense for their characters.
Both Henry and Hans suddenly became gay? They never clearly loved each other in the first game or showed any signs of being interested in men, not even a little. To me, this option only exists to please a rather entitled section of the audience simply because they demand it. When it's jammed into a game as an afterthought, it is bad. That's not being inclusive, that's ticking a box. The issue is that Hans and Henry showed no history of being gay whatsoever. Nothing in the first game. They didn't even stare at each other's butt or even hint at it.
While it's easy to write this off as poorly masked whining, if you go from playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 to watching the Hans romance scene at the end of 2, I can see where this mindset comes from. If you're a queer subtext brain-rotted homo, then maybe you can fill in the gaps, but if you're not, then I can see why you'd think it comes out of nowhere. But the problem with that is that to go from the end of the first game to the end of the Hans romance, you're missing essentially the whole story of 2 and how they got there. Hans is important in the first game, but he's much more relevant to the main plot of the sequel. While there are only a few set points where you make the in-game choice to press a button and flirt and build up to unlocking the romance at the end, the context for all of these moments is much more all-encompassing. A great example of this is a compilation video by Naughty Gaming, the go-to place for everything romance related in games, and their video on Henry and Hans. If you were to just include every explicitly romantic scene in the game, it would be about 20 minutes max, but they've included over 2.5 hours of footage to really try and capture how the romance develops. I'd recommend watching that if you haven't played 2 or just missed the romance when you played it, but I'll give a condensed summary and analysis here. So with that being said, spoilers for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, or at least every scene with Hans. The sequel picks up right where the first ends, with Henry escorting Hans alongside some extra help on the mission they left for at the end of 1. To put it bluntly, things go awry. They're ambushed, everyone except our key pair is killed, they lose everything, and after Hans' stuck-up noble attitude without anything to prove that he's actually noble gets them into a fight, they end up in the stocks. Hans decides that everything in his life has been awful since meeting Henry, and as soon as they're freed, they go their separate ways. During this friendship breakup, both of them try and work on completing their original quest of delivering a message to the local Lord von Burgau. While Henry does this by attempting to earn the trust of the locals to be invited to a noble wedding where Burgau will be in attendance, Hans instead takes up illegal poaching on his land. Skipping forward, the pair reunite at the wedding, and while they initially bicker and socialise separately, after they end up in a fight together against a rowdy group of drunken partygoers, they're finally on the same side again. But since they're at the centre of the trouble, they're imprisoned together in Burgau's base, Trotsky Castle. Even worse, with no proof that they are who they say they are, and with Burgau not actually at the castle, they're no closer to completing their quest. Even worse, they can't even wait out his return, since while Henry is being put to work in the Trotsky Castle prison industrial complex, Hans is being put to death, since he's a pesky poacher who's been trespassing on their lord's land. Thrown into a panic, Henry has until the tower's bell rings 12 times to somehow free Hans from an early grave. After doing as much as he can during the incredibly stress-inducing quest, Henry isn't able to prove Hans' innocence, and in a very dramatic cutscene, Hans is on the brink of being hanged when luckily Burgau returns to the castle, pausing the execution. Finally, Hans and Henry are able to prove their identities, deliver their message, and are given a task to complete for von Burgau to earn his trust. For the first time since the tutorial, Hans and Henry are both together and safe, and as they head out of Trotsky Castle to complete their mission for Burgau, Henry gets the first chance to officially flirt with Hans. With the pressure finally relieved and the high stakes of Hans' life barely being saved, of course emotions are running high. In a moment of significant development for Hans, he begins to apologise to Henry for his part in things going so wrong for them. But Henry cuts him off, and if you choose a romantic dialogue option, he assures Hans that it's no big deal and he can always rely on him. Hans responds by telling him that he's happy that Henry is his page and he wouldn't want anyone else by his side. Without context, this isn't particularly romantic, especially when compared to the flirty dialogue options with the female love interests. However, this clear reiteration of the importance of their bond is just intimate enough to push their relationship in that direction, but they still have the plausible deniability of not being overtly romantic enough to raise eyebrows if it was unreciprocated, because they're both men and we are in 1403 after all. This dialogue establishes a running theme for Henry and Hans' romance of them realising that there's no one they'd rather be with than each other, and how this feeling might transcend being purely platonic. But anyway, they head out on their mission, things are fine until they're not. Notably, Hans is traumatized and develops a fear of tight spaces, then is subsequently taken hostage since he's a nobleman and a good bargaining chip. Henry then spends the next chunk of the game in a new region working towards gaining enough allies to break Hans free from where he's being held captive in Malashov. After hours of preparation, Henry sneaks into the room where Hans and another captive are being kept, and the pair have a touching reunion. Henry's escape plans are thrown for a loop when Hans refuses to even consider taking the secret passage that Henry took to get in. His facade is that it's not that chivalrous, but it's clear that he doesn't want to end up in another cramped space. In an effort to comfort and convince him, the second official chance to flirt is Henry telling him that they'll manage to do it together. Henry reiterates that he won't let anything happen to Hans, and even reminds him of the first time he flirted at Trotsky Castle. Even though it doesn't convince Hans, he tells Henry that he remembers what he's referring to, but is worried about putting him in danger if he faints or goes mad in the passageway. Even though it's not openly that romantic, they do have an audience after all, so it makes sense that they would be restrained, it's important that we get to see how even though he's technically being selfish, Hans is considering Henry's safety as a priority too, so in the end they have to escape in a more chaotic way and somehow manage to get out. Fast forward, Hans reunites with his uncle and discovers that he's having an arranged marriage. Minor setback. Skip ahead again, and for once Hans isn't kidnapped or on the verge of death, and is instead on a quest together with Henry, this time as part of a heist on Kuttenberg's Italian court. Things are going to plan, and Hans is on the lookout to keep an eye out for reinforcements. While most of the heist group are carrying away the goods, in a rare moment of peace, Henry and him get to catch up, and for our third official flirt, Henry complains to Hans that they don't get to spend much time together anymore. Hans will dismiss him and insist that things will go back to normal soon, but Henry can double down and say that he misses spending time with Hans in particular. Hans doesn't pick up on the vibe, casually saying he feels the same, and Henry is visibly disappointed. But don't worry, just a little later in the same quest, once things have gone to shit and the group have to escape, they're forced to take a narrow underground passage out. There's an explosion and everyone's disoriented, but once things have calmed down a bit, Henry finds Hans in a side room all by himself. Clearly both shocked at how Hans was able to overcome his fear, Henry tells Hans he wouldn't be able to forgive himself if something happened to him. Hans assures him that it wouldn't have been his fault, and for flirt number 4, Henry can state quite bluntly that it isn't a professional obligation for him, and that it's because he cares about him perhaps more than he knows. Even with the need for the aforementioned plausible deniability, this is Henry's most clear indication of romantic intentions. With quite a hard to read response, Hans tells him that he cares too, and it's clear that he'll need more time to think about it. Soon after, the pair get stuck in the siege of Sukdol, and it goes on for much longer than anyone expected. With supplies running low, Henry is given the task of sneaking out to find reinforcements, practically a suicide mission given how much they're surrounded, but it's essentially the only way they can win. The night before leaving, Henry can go and visit Hans in his bedroom to say goodbye, and if you've taken every chance to flirt with Hans before this, you can complete the romance. With complete privacy and the real possibility of this being their last chance to ever talk to each other and address what's being building between them, it's the perfect opportunity for everything to come to a head. Instead of describing, it's too good, I'll just play it.
You see, I've been thinking a lot about the two of us, and about what you told me in Malashov.
And?
You see, once I heard a French minstrel tell a tale about two knights. They met on the battlefield, where they faced each other. One as a commander, the other as a Black Knight.
The Black Knight? Like he was fighting, dressed all in black?
A Black Knight is someone who fights in battle, but doesn't wear his colours.
Why?
Sometimes it does more harm than good. In this story, he probably wanted to mask his fame, because it was Lancelot. When Gaelhaut, the other knight, saw the Black Knight fight, he and his army surrendered, even though they had the upper hand. After the battle, the knights met. They grew close to each other, and from then on, they only fought side by side. When on campaign, they slept in the same tent. They even seduced court ladies together.
So how does their story end?
They went through a lot together. Until Lancelot was eventually captured. Everyone thought he was dead. When Gaelhaut found out, well, he was distraught. He felt life was meaningless all of a sudden. In the end, he dies too, of grief and sorrow. Henry, if anything happens to you, then, why the hell can't I save you once for a change?
I'll be back. I promise you. No, everything will be all right. I'll bring reinforcements.
I'm sorry. I just
While this is our last official romance scene, after Henry returns from his quest successfully and the siege of Suchdol finally ends, Henry and Hans have the chance for one more conversation before the game finishes. During the conversation, while they don't explicitly reflect on their night together, there's no regrets, no shame between them, and Hans even suggests that the pair find somewhere more private to settle once things calm down. His arranged marriage is mentioned, and even if you don't romance Hans, he's not happy about it. He plans to avoid it for as long as possible and says he'll feign illness when the time comes. But it's clear he knows he can't avoid it forever and tells Henry that if he has a son he'll name it after him. Very typical nobleman with a gay lover business there. If you're coming from the end of the first game and skip straight to that final scene, or even if you've played 2 but didn't make any effort to romance Hans throughout the game, it's easy to see why some people might see it as coming out of nowhere. However, with all the context and build up, the slow burn, you can't really say that the payoff isn't earned unless you're being intentionally thick. It's why I think that most of the people who criticise the romance for this reason likely just didn't do it. When you see someone say,
"It's not about it just being an option, it's about how the dialogues are constructed. Hey, I care about you. Me too. Kiss."
it's easy to come to the conclusion that they're likely saying that without the full context. If you're the type of person to go online and comment about a gay romance being forced in for the sake of it, you're probably not the type of person to go out of your way to commit to said gay romance for an entire 50 to 100 hour game, as opposed to choosing the straight romance options. If you did do this though, and you still think it's unnatural, I'm genuinely interested in what about the relationship you had issue with. The reason, in my opinion, why the relationship with Hans is so easy to believe and follow and get invested in is because it interweaves so naturally with the narrative of the main story. This is easiest to see when comparing it to the other romances. Excluding the one-night stands for the sake of brevity, for Clara, the first chance to romance her is part of the main story, and if you reject her, she'll accuse you of being too dedicated to Hans. But her second romance scene is much easier to miss, and Margaret, while entertaining, is completely optional, and pretty simple to overlook entirely. Then for Rosa and Catherine, while they're both more relevant to the overarching story, they're more tricky to romance. You'll need to complete missable side quests for both of them, and the dialogue trees you have to navigate to flirt with them are a little trickier to work through as well. In comparison, each of the 5 chances to flirt with Hans are during core story missions. On top of this, all of them except for the third are in conversations you can't miss for the story to proceed. Even then, with that third conversation, Hans is standing right near the person you need to talk to proceed the story, so it's pretty natural to talk to him at that point anyway. Currently, there's no officially confirmed canon romance in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, but with how important Henry's relationship with Hans is to the overall story, and how naturally romancing him fits into this, the easiest and most convincing answer would be Hans. It's why when I see comments saying,
adding something in for the sake of adding it is bad storytelling,
it just feels like you're self-reporting that you don't really know what you're talking about. But like I said, the relationship coming out of nowhere isn't the only reason that people don't like this romance. So tell me this, why can't men just be friends anymore?
Hold it!
In the wise words of critically reviewed actor Anthony Mackie,
You know, the idea of two guys being friends and loving each other in 2021 is a problem because of the exploitation of homosexuality. So, you know, it used to be guys could be friends, we could hang out, we can do this, and it was cool. You know, you would always meet your friends at the bar, you know, but you can't do that anymore because something as pure and beautiful as homosexuality is being exploited by people who are trying to rationalize themselves.
I love this response from Mackie when asked about the potential for a gay relationship in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so much so that it's my second time using it, because amongst his rambling he picks up on the phenomenon that is colonizing media, and real life too, that men aren't allowed to care for each other without it being gay. No one is safe, not even Henry and Hans.
They fall into a huge cliche. The idea that a man cannot be sentimental with another man, that a man cannot care about another man without making him homosexual. Some of us men yearn for a strictly platonic male friendship. This is a missed opportunity to give it that twist, showing that two men can have a deep relationship, care about each other, and be affectionate without making them even remotely homosexual. Friendship and camaraderie between men is undesirable to some. It must be corrupted. It falls into the trope that feeling anything for another man is gay.
And I think that last point there is the core of this misconception. This isn't a trope. The Hans and Henry friends to lovers wouldn't have gained so much flack if this was something that happened often enough for it to fall into trope territory. In truth, I think the reason why you see this rhetoric so often online is because it isn't actually reflected in mainstream media, but instead in online shipping culture. This is not something that regularly infects male friendships in media. Anthony Mackie's interview response isn't even responding to an actual gay relationship, just the fact that people were talking about the chance of one online. While I'm sure this is is not the only reason. A large contributor to why male-male pairings are so popular in shipping culture is because they're so commonly underrepresented. Hans and Henry were a pretty obscure relationship pairing after the release of Kingdom Come Deliverance. These shippers were fully aware that this is a rare pair with a slim to none chance of ever materializing. Now as their lottery winnings, they can go on to tell future generations about how dreams can come true, but that's exactly the case, because this doesn't happen often. Unlike with the argument that the relationship comes out of nowhere, I can't argue that Hans and Henry aren't a friendship that turns into a romance, because to do so would be ignoring the facts. But if Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 really wanted to go against tropes, then the romances it should have avoided were with characters like Rosa and Catherine. While Henry has plenty of platonic friendships and camaraderie formed with men throughout the sequel, the only one that can turn romantic is with Hans. But the only two female characters in the main cast who have any major bearing on the plot and form a friendship with Henry are Rosa and Catherine, both of which have a chance to turn romantic. If we want a true trope, then it's how often male and female characters aren't allowed to be friends without an eventual romance. It transcends trope status to just be seen as expected when a male and female pairing share enough screen time, in spite of how common different gender friendships are in real life. It's a shame because these critiques of Hans and Henry's friendship developing into a romance often come alongside accusations of it being a forced-in afterthought.
This seems like a dainty feel-good inclusion for the sake of it, rather than it being integral to the game's plot.
It's a double standard that straight romances don't have to face this unrealistic, ever-moving goalpost of making perfect in-universe sense and being of utmost importance to the narrative without being in your face or pushy. And side note, games with multiple romances for the sake of the narrative are intentionally designed to not be plot relevant. It's not usually a critique because it's literally how these romances are designed most of the time. You can beat the game and never meet Margaret. No one's complaining about her not impacting the narrative. Anyway, in reality, if you're worried about your friends calling you gay for being too affectionate, then you need better friends, or you need to be more secure in your sexuality. You being uncomfortable hugging your bros doesn't mean that Hans and Henry shouldn't be allowed to cross swords. If you want representation of purely platonic male friendships in film, TV, games, whatever, then I could quadruple the length of this video at least by just listing the names of the best. But if I have to recommend just one, then I'd go with The Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Take that!
While it is by far the weakest argument against Henry and Hans, it's something that comes up when people are at the end of their wits trying to argue against the pairing, and that is that the relationship is inappropriate because Hans is underage.
Hans Capon is canonically 15 years old apparently in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 according to their in-game historical records. Yet you can romance him in the game if you make Henry gay, effectively meaning that yeah, this is technically illegal to showcase in the game.
One of the more dramatic headlines from veritable fountain of journalistic integrity, Fandom Pulse, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 features graphic depiction of child sodomy. If you've been experiencing this video audio only and you haven't played either Kingdom Come Deliverance game, then your ears might perk up and you might think this is a valid point. If Hans is 15 and Henry is an adult, then of course their relationship would be reprehensible and beyond defense. But this argument begins to crumble when you acknowledge that Hans isn't 15. Well, he is, but he isn't. Based on historical records and the game's codex, Jan Potacek of Perkstein, the real person that Hans Capon the character is an adaptation of, was 15. However, Hans Capon the character is not.
Historically, Skalitz hasn't been raided by the time KCD2 happened, and the bold German knight was long dead before that. The character Hans Capon is acknowledged as an adult during the quest The Hunt. Henry points out Hans doesn't look underage and he doesn't get why he's not in charge yet, seeing as he's a grown man. Hans explains that noble heirs like him are usually declared of age and given the right to rule either by the king, who is currently a hostage, or by a council of nobles, who are not willing to travel because of the war. So Game Hans is a grown man who is stuck in the role of a child until someone with the authority to say he's no longer a child comes along. KCD is based on the foundation of historical events, but that doesn't mean it sticks true to history.
It's notable that no one cared about Hans being of age when he was bragging about banging women in the first game. It's only a problem when he could be gay. It also quite literally says if you go to the effort of actually getting to the bottom of his codex entry in the game itself. Unlike his historical precursor, however, we took the poetic license of making Hans Capon a 20-year-old man in our game. Also, for anyone who's looking at Hans in-game, it's very clear that he's an adult man. Luke Dale, the voice actor and motion capture model for the character, was in his early 20s during the first game and was in his late 20s for the sequel. And I mean this is no insult to Luke Dale, but he very much looks his age and could not pass for under 18, let alone 15, especially in the sequel. On the topic of Luke Dale, perhaps the biggest Hans and Henry shipper of them all, he's gone out of his way to address this exact point.
Never stated in game, but according to the history of Jan Potacek of Perkstein, Hans and Henry would have been 15 in this game. No, they're not 15. Basically, what happened was, so there is something known as artistic license, where, you know, for the story to work, you kind of have to play fast and loose with history a little bit. So there are certain elements of the game that, you know, aren't entirely in conjunction with exactly as things happened in history. There's many examples of this, but no, they made Hans older because, you know, it's an adult game, it's an 18, so it wouldn't be right to have him as being 15, the things that he does. So to all the idiots out there that say he's 15, they can all fuck off and shut the fuck up. Anyway, moving on.
Come on, Luke, tell us what you really think. I referenced it in the previous section, but I think part of the reason why the anti-woke crowd are so thrown off by the Hans and Henry relationship, but also why it's exploded in popularity so quickly among the opposite circle, is that unlike what the male friendship yearners would want you to believe, this isn't the type of relationship we see often in gaming. And while being gay is of course part of this, that's only really the tip of the blade. Not only is having a queer romance in a game on this scale unfortunately still quite rare, but what makes it even more rare is having it between two actual characters. My bubble was kind of burst when I realised that most of the popular gay romances in gaming have one thing in common, being character creators. The titles that come up the most often were Dragon Age, Mass Effect and Baldur's Gate 3, and for all of these the romance is between an actual in-game character and a protagonist that you've created. I'm not pointing this out to shit on character creators, I love a character creator and I love a lot of these games I just mentioned, but it's hard to deny that character created protagonists tend to be a bit two-dimensional. I liked my Tav in Baldur's Gate, I liked my Inquisitor in Dragon Age, but they were nowhere near as fleshed out as the other characters in those games, because to make them truly feel like a self-insert where you can make influential in-world decisions, sacrifices have to be made in giving them a backstory and a personality that is just plain enough that you can project onto it. My most recent example is romancing Emmerich in Veilguard. Okay, that's enough time for you to comment your opinion about Veilguard. I really enjoyed his character, so getting to romance him and learn more about him was a treat, but it didn't feel like he was romancing my character in particular, rather that it was him romancing, well, someone, because they can only personalise his dialogue so much to fit the vastly different ways you could customise your character's personality and backstory. The developers can make a valiant effort, but it can only go so far. It is worth mentioning that sometimes the side characters you don't romance can form their own relationships, the best example in this case being Dorian and Ironball from Dragon Age Inquisition. While these are entertaining and worth mentioning, because they aren't centred around a main character, they often aren't given as much attention and grandeur as a primary romance. Henry and Hans on the other hand are both characters and also the two most important characters in the game. Hans in the more traditional sense, yes he's slightly archetypal, the archetype being the damsel in distress, but he's given plenty of development to be incredibly likeable and believable in spite of how frustrating he can be at points. Henry is more interesting to me because he's like the anti-character creator protagonist. He has dialogue choices and different options, but instead of those being used as a way to project your personality onto a blank slate, they're instead just options that highlight different aspects of Henry's personality. You can make certain choices for him, for example, who he romances, but he's still the same person, and you can see this in his arc throughout both games and how he grows. Because Hans and Henry are two fully realised separate characters, their dynamic has more complex ways to grow and build off of each other. With a character creator romance, it's like a plant growing around a column, perhaps a pretty column that you've decorated, but still a static structure. With Henry and Hans, it's like two plants growing and interweaving together, not completely in your control, but more engaging because of it. There are other romances like this in games, but very few are 1. Gay, 2. in a non-fiction setting, and 3. in a bigger, more mainstream game. I'm not saying that to discount straight versions of this romance, fantasy versions, and especially not indie versions, but what I am saying is that it puts Hans and Henry in a very unique box. Just to give some more attention to that non-fiction setting category I mentioned, Kingdom Come Deliverance takes it a step further by having a historical setting as well. The element of historical accuracy, as you can imagine, is often cited by detractors as a reason why Henry and Hans' relationship isn't feasible. It's ironic because the existence of gay people in this setting is one of the aspects of the game's dedication to historical accuracy that we can guarantee. The existence of people under all parts of the queer umbrella has been proven all throughout history with overwhelming evidence. By now, most people are able to see past this attempt to paint queerness as a modern phenomenon as a lazy strategy to justify the flavour of the week bigotry whatever grifter is trying to push. Because of this, Henry and Hans' relationship is presented pretty realistically for what could be expected of this era. Flirting is subtle, masked in layers of subtext, and any overt displays of affection are kept private. There isn't a coming out scene or any modern queer terminology, it's why the relationship is believable and engaging, adding another layer to why I find this particular romance intriguing for the space it fills in gaming. It's typical that this is the aspect which that crowd critique as poor historical accuracy, when the first game, which faced heaps of criticism by genuine historians, partially for the lack of realistic representation, is what that same group laud as a gold standard for their definition of historical accuracy. I really shouldn't give it this much time of day, but they make it so easy to brush off. Side note, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's public approach to historical accuracy compared to the first is actually really interesting. The Warhorse PR manager, Tobias Stoll-Zwilling, actually went on a mini press tour to essentially temper expectations for the second after the first didn't reach the high standard they set up for themselves. I'd recommend reading on them if you want some more insight into how historical accuracy is accounted for in the sequel. Back to business though, not to further tighten the box that Henry and Hans fit into, even though it's not a word that either of them would ever use since it's centuries away from its first use, but the pair are both fantastic bi representation as well. When looking at lists of popular bi characters in more mainstream games, while there are some great characters in there, a lot of them are just, this character is bi because they can romance a protagonist no matter their gender, or this protagonist can romance any character no matter their gender. And while that inclusion is important, it's great to see representation that is less focused on in-game mechanics. Of course, in real life you don't have to be visibly bisexual to count as bisexual, that's a given, but in Henry and Hans's case, they're both pretty textbook. They're shown to be attracted to women in the first game, and that continues into the second, but with them both having each other as a romance option throughout as well. Also, while we don't know what Hans does behind closed doors, since we don't follow him all the time, we do know that Henry isn't just Hans-sexual, and one of the flings available mid-game is with Black Bartosz, a sword fighter working at Trotsky Castle. It's a shame then that this aspect of Hans and Henry's sexuality is being muffled a bit, and really for the wrong reasons. With how loud the complaints were about Hans and Henry's romance, saying, oh, they weren't gay in the first game, why are they being forced on characters I like? Defenders of the game and even developers, notably Dan Vavra, have really pushed the rhetoric that the characters are only bi if you make them, and that it's fully optional. And while there is some truth to that, I also don't think we should be suppressing good representation for the sake of sedating bigots who have repeatedly displayed an inability to listen to reason. Sure, if you don't choose to romance Hans or Black Bartosz, Henry doesn't act on his attraction to men, but that doesn't mean that the option isn't there. It doesn't mean that he wasn't thinking about it. And I'll take it a step further and say, yes, Hans and Henry are even bisexual in the first game. Sure, the devs might not have known it yet, but now they do, and now they are. You might call it a retcon, I call it development. I think it all works to make Hans and Henry's relationship more interesting and engaging.
Why not just make a new original IP about the history of homosexuality? Why leech onto sequels asking for shoehorned changes?
Why? Because it makes their relationship more entertaining. I haven't exactly made a friend of the male friendship yearner community anyway, so at this point I'm happy to say that I think a romance forming between two male friends is more engaging than just another male friendship. Even if it is apparently a trope, it's a trope I enjoy. No surprises there. So I've just made a pretty substantial case for why Hans and Henry's relationship is so unique in the gaming sphere, but to challenge that I want to see how close I can get with what's already out there. Sure, I called the last section one of a kind, but perhaps that was a bit hyperbolic. It might seem like I'm including the section to cover my ass and preempt comments, but honestly I'm hoping for the opposite. If you have any queer romances in games that you think are comparable to Hans and Henry, or you just particularly enjoy, even if it's in a smaller game, a fantasy game, whatever, I want to hear it. I'm always looking for recommendations after all, and I love hearing what people have to say about what I have to say, but if there's a section of the video I want to encourage comments on, it's this. Aside from the series I've already mentioned in the previous section, I think one of the most mainstream franchises to have gay romances in a mostly non-fiction setting is Life is Strange. Honestly, I haven't played them, but from a quick bit of research and osmosis from friends, I know that all 3 mainline entries feature queer romances, and these romances feature the lead characters who aren't character created, so that's all pretty good. Of course, the series doesn't feature a historical setting, and from what I know there's some light science fiction thrown in, so it's not a truly non-fiction setting. And while I know the first game was successful, from what I've seen the series has gotten a bit less mainstream with each subsequent entry. However, it would be a disservice not to mention it. One of the more mainstream examples, even if it is technically an indie game and definitely a strong stride into fantasy territory, is Hades. Zagreus, the main character, has 3 romance options, one of them being Thanatos. It's been a while since I played through this romance, but it stuck with me enough to remember that I enjoyed the slow burn over the length of the game, and the dynamic between the 2 characters, since they have their own distinct personalities and charming interactions. A more recent example, in an incredibly mainstream legacy series, even if they aren't the main characters, is Dion and Terrence from Final Fantasy XVI. This is fully a nepotism pick. I just love the way their relationship is depicted, and how it intertwines with Dion's personal development throughout the rest of the game. While they aren't main characters and it's very much a fantasy title, the relationship dynamic, or trope some might say, of a nobleman and his page is of course an easy comparison to Henry and Hans. It would also be remiss to not mention Ellie from The Last of Us. I've so far only played through the main campaign of the first game without any of the DLC, but even without research, I know that Ellie is one of the most prominent lesbians in gaming, and this can be seen in the romances throughout the series. I just haven't played through any of them yet. As much as I would like to say that I'm aware of every queer character and romance in gaming, I know that I could research for days on end and I would still miss something. This section is more to emphasize the unique niche that Hans and Henry have carved for themselves, but also, like I said, I'm always looking for recommendations and to hear other people's opinions on this, so if you think there's a glaring oversight or just an obscure favourite that you want to mention, let me know. Going back to Hans and Henry, while I think I've exhausted as much as I can say about their romance from the first game and into the sequel, where can it go from here? Well, narratively and financially speaking, it seems like a third Kingdom Come Deliverance makes sense. Without delving too deep into spoilers, the second game leaves a few narrative threads open and history continues. Characters like Hans and Zizka have plenty of interesting life ahead of them which hasn't been covered in the games. Just based on how the second ends, it doesn't feel like they're leaving the door unlocked for a sequel, it's wide open. It's only a case of official confirmation. And then I also mentioned the financial side. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 has been a massive success commercially, making back its budget in a matter of weeks, proving that there's an audience for games like this. I'm very much getting ahead of myself. At the time of writing, the game is only 29 days old, so I doubt we're going to get any official news about this for years. But the reason I bring up a continuation is to hypothesize about how Hans and Henry's romance will be treated. In the first game, the canon romance option was Teresa. There was even a whole DLC quest dedicated to her relationship with Henry. Moving into the sequel, you're given a chance to acknowledge Teresa and essentially roleplay as having done her romance, or lean away from it if you didn't. This is the most efficient method given that Teresa isn't present in 2. For Hans though, it would be a little more awkward. Unlike Teresa, there's a good chance that he'll be present for the story of 3 given how linked he is with Henry, but it's not a guarantee. Unlike him, Henry isn't based on a real person, so Warhorse can do what they want with him, but for Hans, at least showing up is likely. Best case scenario, like with Teresa, early on in the game you could be given an option to opt in to continuing or just maintaining the romance with Hans, with a dialogue option, or with another dialogue option you can opt out if you didn't play 2 or didn't romance Hans. This would be the most graceful, if high effort solution, but if you played the game, you'll know that Warhorse are more than happy to take into account the most random choices in gameplay with surprising attention to detail, so I wouldn't say this is anywhere near being outside the realm of possibility. A sadder outcome would be Hans's romance being decanonized at some point and no trace of it being in a third entry. Like I said, sad, especially considering how well Hans's romance ties into the overall narrative, but there's no point getting worked up about hypotheticals. Even so, it would be very interesting to see how the relationship continues if given the opportunity. Hans has a wedding he'll eventually need to attend. There are multiple historic events coming up, and depending on how close they want to stick to history, Hans will eventually end up having a child, and he even has a death at some point. Unfortunately, a 637-year-old Jan Pachartek of Perkstein isn't still hobbling around somewhere in Czechia. But as has been established, Warhorse are happy to bend history to tell a more engaging story, so who knows. For all we know, there might be new Hans and Henry content in the second game still to come. There's 3 waves of paid DLC story quests being added throughout the rest of the year, and while we don't know when this will take place narratively or even if Hans will be present, there's still a chance. But if there's one person we can count on to push for more Hans and Henry content, it's Luke Dale. If you're not finding him making statements about wanting to fuck himself or telling people to shut up if they call Hans 15, you'll find him commenting on hansry edits on TikTok or tweeting his support for the pairing. Also, I'm pretty sure Tom McKay, the voice and face of Henry, wouldn't be opposed to continuing the relationship either. In researching this, I discovered his first credited acting role was all the way back in 2005 in lesbian rom-com Imagine Me and You, where he plays Michael 2. I just thought this would be a funny detail and he would be some random background character with one line, but he is possibly the best version of this. I decided it'd be fun to watch a movie and keep an eye out for him, and I discovered that Michael 2 is one of 2 gay men, both called Michael, dogging in a park at night, discovered by the main characters. So he's clearly been comfortable playing characters attracted to men for years now. I wonder if he drew inspiration from Michael 2 when he was flirting with Hans. I think I've now sufficiently gotten ahead of myself, but if you have anything particular on your wishlist for a hypothetical Kingdom Come Deliverance 3, then let me know. But no matter what direction the series goes in, or if this is where it ends, Hans and Henry over the course of both games stand as one of the best slow burn romances in gaming.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much for making it to the end. This is usually where I thank everyone who helped me and plug the channel, and I will, but since this video was made so soon after the game's release, as well as a new update, there are actually some extra details that came too soon to properly integrate into the whole thing, but interesting enough to be worth mentioning here, so stay tuned for that. Firstly though, I want to thank the amazingly talented Spectremarvel for letting me use their artwork for the thumbnail. It immediately stood out to me when I saw it, and they were so friendly when I asked if I could use it here, so make sure to give them a follow on Tumblr or Twitter with the links in the description. I also have the usual thank yous for Annie and Jay. Annie has once again helped me make the script so much more legible in the editing process, and not only has Jay helped me with voicing the quotes per usual, he's also been borrowing my copy of the game to play through it himself. Because of this, he helped me record some of the clips from earlier in the game while he was playing it himself. But don't worry, I've already paid him back by helping him restart the game after he irreparably ruined his reputation in Trotsky by immediately stealing a horse as soon as he finished a tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, then I'd very much appreciate it if you subscribe or drop a like, since it helps massively, and this type of video is what I love to make most. I don't always talk about gay shit, but it's definitely a habit. So if you want something similar, my gay Persona and Fire Emblem videos are something on the same path, but if you just want to hear me talk about video games for even longer, then my ranking of everything I played last year is a perfect background watch. But anyway, back to those aforementioned updates. The hype for the game seems to have barely died down since release, and the press tour is still ongoing. The best example of this is Luke Dale recently mentioning in an interview that the fans lobbied for hansry, so perhaps those rare pair shippers I mentioned earlier were a little more influential than I thought. Or perhaps more likely, the fan Luke is referring to is himself. But more notable are details that have been picked up on since the most recent 1.2 update. Most notable is a short homoerotic poem that can be found under Hans's bed in Devil's Den. On one hand, it's hilarious and telling that this poetry is found whether you romance Hans or not, but upon my own investigation, it's found even before Hans moves into the room. This could be a bug, but I think its placement and addition there is fully intentional. Something more subtle that I also saw recently, and I'm not sure if this is an addition with the update or just an easy to miss detail, but if you bug Hans enough at the Semine wedding before they've made up, he'll tell Henry that he wasn't good enough for him. It's minor, but it's a nice extra layer of Hans's character that we missed during their friendship breakup. While these are quite small in the grand scheme and wouldn't have changed the content of the main video that much, I do think they serve as a hint that there can and might be more Hans and Henry content in the upcoming DLC. For example, I can easily see horse racing against Hans in that update being an easy way to sneak in new dialogue, and who knows if he'll be present for any of the free paid missions. Also, while I hope it wasn't too egregious, I apologise for any poor pronunciation of Czech words or names. I tried my best, but I could only work against my accent so much. Now that's out of the way, thank you so much for making it all the way to the real end. Like always, all of my sources are in the description, so if you want to read up on anything, it's there. I don't have any solid plans for what I'll post next. I got the idea to do something about Zelda, but that'll take a little while longer. Also, if you've been watching the ends of my videos specifically for a little while now, you'll know that my Kid Icarus video might as well be made up. I once again started working towards finishing it in January, but I realised it's been so long since I wrote the original script back in mid-2023 that I just don't have the same desire to talk about it in the way I did. But I do have an idea about how I want to essentially build it from the ground up, so if anything, there's a chance that could be what I post next, but who knows. I should, but honestly I don't. But anyway, now we're really at the end. Thanks for watching.